Hello, my name is Tom, we are here at Gamechanger Audio and this is the MOTOR Synth MKII. This video features the modulation section, which can modulate nearly any parameter on a motor synth, regardless of it being on the front panel or in various screens. I will show you the modulator setup process, as well as play a few musical examples, and finally, I will share a few tricks how to maximize the utility of the modulation section beyond what might initially seem possible. This is one of many videos in which we explore all aspects of the motor synth. The link to the full playlist is in the description below. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to catch future videos. The modulation section consists of 3 independent modulators. Each can be assigned to 2 different parameters in A and B slots, and each slot can have its own depth and polarity. In addition, each modulator has a fully featured envelope that controls the modulation depth. Assigning modulators to parameters is easy. Press Alt and the Assign button. Now you can choose the modulator and the slot that you want to use. Let's take modulator 1 and slot A. Press the Assign button again to confirm selection. Now you can wiggle any knob on the front panel or any parameter in various screens to choose as a destination. Let's take cross modulation depth. Press Alt and Assign to confirm. Now I have assigned modulator 1 slot A to the cross mod depth. Now let's change the assignment to different parameters. You get the idea. The modulators can be assigned to nearly any parameter on the motor synth. Let's dig deeper. The controls on the front panel are very simple, and they are intended for performance once the modulators are set up. Here you have the switch for choosing A or B destination. The modulation depth and polarity can be controlled for each assignment individually. This allows for nuanced but related modulations on 2 parameters at the same time. In this patch, the A slot modulates the volume on the first motor voice, and the slot B modulates the second voice. But the polarity on the B slot is inverted. This creates a lovely stereo tremolo sound. You can of course set up both destinations with the same polarity to get the regular in-phase tremolo sound. You can use the Alt button to control the depth of both destinations at the same time. You can change the modulation speed using the rate knob. At any given moment, you can also subdivide the chosen rate for quick rhythmical adjustments. In terms of waveforms, you can choose between a stepped waveform, triangle, pulse width, ramp, and sawtooth. All of these classic waveforms can be further adjusted in the mod shape screen, but we'll get back to that a bit later. Each modulator can be driven by one of several different clock sources. It can be an internal arbitrary frequency, master tempo, the frequency of note that you're playing, or the clock of another modulator. Let's look at them one by one with musical examples that I have already prepared. The most basic option, I guess, is setting the frequency freely with the rate knob. At any given moment, you can also subdivide that frequency for quick rhythmical jumps. Another option for the clock source is to use the frequency of one of the other two modulators, essentially syncing them together. This is useful when you want to create rhythmically related modulations and then change the rate of all modulations while maintaining that rhythm. In this next patch, I have set up all three modulators to perform amplitude modulation on all three voices. The first modulator is set to an arbitrary frequency, but the second and third modulator are synced to the first modulator and they subdivide the frequency of the first modulator. If I change the rate of this modulator, the second and third modulator will follow. Bonus points for using the B slot of the first modulator to modulate the subdivision of the second modulator, which is synced to the first modulator. Yes, the modulators can be cross-modulated. Modulators can of course be synced to the master tempo, so that they are perfectly in time with the built-in arpeggiator, sequencer, or external MIDI gear. In this patch, I have the first modulator controlling the cross-mod depth. The waveform is set to a narrow pulse width, producing an accent-type sound. The second modulator is set to sawtooth, and it modulates the cutoff frequency for all three filters. Both of them are synced to the master tempo. The last available clock source is the note that you are playing. Take the frequency of that note, or a subdivision if necessary, and use that for modulation. Higher the note, faster the modulation. This technique beautifully ties the modulation with the notes that you are playing. This next patch created by my colleague relies on slow acceleration times. This means that all notes take long time to rev up to the target pitch. The second modulator uses note frequency as the clock source. As a result, the modulation rate glides together with the notes. Let's explore the ways how we can control the modulation wave shape. A small but very useful utility in the modulation screen is the phase reset parameter. If the phase reset parameter is set to off, the modulation waveform just runs at the set frequency. If the modulation produces a prominent and rhythmical effect, triggering a note off the grid can produce undesirable clunky effect. Instead of this messy sound, we can turn the phase reset on. Now each time a note is triggered, the modulation wave shape will be reset. This will produce a lovely rhythmical sound. waveform starting position can be controlled in the mod shape screen with the parameter called x-axis offset. The curve parameter allows us to change the curvature of the waveform. The x-axis offset parameter allows to alter the phase relationships between all three modulators. You can use this to create interesting effects when all modulators are set to similar or even the same waveform, but each with different phase offset. In this patch, all three modulators are set to the same waveform with 5 downward steps. Each modulator controls the octave of each voice. However, all modulators are offset on the x-axis. In other words, their phases do not align. This produces a lovely canon effect. Stepped voltage is not only the 5 downward steps, instead there are multiple of options that you can choose. You can have steps going up and steps going down. You can choose how many steps there are per one modulation cycle. There's also noise and pre-programmed patterns. But my personal favorite option under the stepped waveform is the stepped random voltages. I like using random voltages in my patches to introduce some uncertainty, and then find a nice balance between control and randomness. In this patch, the amp envelopes for the motor voices are set to the looping AD envelopes. As long as I keep a key pressed down, the envelopes will continuously loop with the rate set by attack and decay. The modulators are set to random voltages, and they modulate the decay time of the amp envelopes, changing the loop length. The slope time smoothens out the transitions between the random voltage steps, producing a smooth random voltage. And the last parameter that I want to point out from the mod shape screen is the scale parameter. The scale parameter reduces the maximum possible modulation depth accessible with this knob. Rarely does it sound good if a parameter is modulated throughout the full scope of it. In most cases, we want a limited modulation depth. Normally, the depth knob is used for exactly this purpose, but then you can't perform with it, because you have found the right modulation depth and you don't want to lose it by wiggling the knob. The scale parameter fixes this. You can set the desired modulation depth for when the knob is set to the maximum position. Now you can use it as a performance tool with a sweet spot right at the end. This next patch utilizes a pretty nice trick possible with the pulse width waveform. The pulse width waveform is modulating the detune of one of the motor voices. I'm setting the pulse width to 100% duty cycle, essentially turning it into a steady offset. Then the scale parameter is set so that when the knob is in the maximum position, I'm getting a perfect fifth above the target pitch. The last major part of the modulation section is the envelope encoder. Each modulator has its own dedicated, fully featured multi-mode envelope that controls the modulation depth. The modulation envelopes work exactly the same as amp envelopes and filter envelopes, and that's why we have already covered them in a dedicated video. Make sure to watch it. To not leave you empty-handed, I will show you 3 musical examples of how I like to use the envelopes in the modulation section. In this patch, I have the third modulator controlling the digital voice frequency, and it is a classic delayed LFO sound made possible with a slow envelope attack. When I trigger a note, it takes time for the modulation to fade in. Now it's time for my favorite modulation envelope trick. As I said before, there are amp envelopes and filter envelopes, but most of the parameters on the motor synth do not have a dedicated envelope. There's a way how you can take the modulation envelope and assign it to the parameter that doesn't have one. Here I'm using the pulse width waveform to modulate the filter resonance for motor voice 1 and motor voice 2. The trick here again is to set the pulse width duty cycle to 100%, turning the pulse width into a steady offset. Now if I'm using the modulation envelope to modulate that offset, I'm essentially applying this envelope to the resonance. This allows me to create short plucks of resonance whenever I'm hitting a key. This was a rundown of the most important features of the modulation section. Still, I was only scratching the surface of what is possible musically with it. Now it's up to you to come up with your own examples.